I'm Dave.
And I'm Rob.
I'm a millennial. No, you're a millennial. Shit, which one am I? I'm Gen Z.
We don't have to do that every time if you don't want to, but...
It's fine. But which one am I? Generation X?
Yes.
I'm Dave.
I'm Rob.
We've got the same dad.
But we didn't meet until I was 16.
And I was a lot older. So this is the podcast where...
we share an album that...
helps us make up for lost time. Which is what you're supposed to say.
Because that's important. when re-establishing links with a long-lost sibling.
So in summary...
you're editing this one.
These are the albums that...
your...
brother...
should...
No. This episode, well, I am sharing music, but I am sharing a whole chunk of my childhood with my brother. Yes, today it is the turn of Ultravox and the album Vienna. First question always before we get into it is, when I said Ultravox Vienna, wow, I mean, this is proper 1980s, possibly a little bit obscure. What did you know? What did you think, Rob?
Well, obviously, from the off, everyone knows the tune Vienna, and we're going to come on to that. But the other thing I thought was cool, because I interviewed this guy called Midger who had a very strong accent and seemed like a really nice bloke about, 10 odd years ago, but never got around to listening to his music. So this is grand. And I was very excited.
Wow. So you interviewed him without listening to his music?
Well, without a great deal of,
Rude.
I knew Vienna and Do They Know It's Christmas, which is Wikipedia informs me is the height of his discography. So
I was going to say that's kind of the opposite, the bookends of the rainbow spectrum of his artistic credibility, probably. But there you go. Anyway, it's not just about Midger, it is about Ultravox. But so you knew, but interviewing him isn't the same as, well, what did you know about him? So what did you know about Ultravox?
Very little. I knew that it was one of 3 or 4 bands that this guy was involved in. And I subsequently picked up a charity shop special of an album by Visage.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Which was quite scratchy, but I recall kind of enjoying it if it was a little bit, dated, shall we say. Yeah.
All right. So, quick potted history. I mean, Ultravox's heyday, undeniably, were probably the 4 albums which we'll talk about between 1980 and 1984.
Of which this is the first.
Yes. So, it's actually their 4th album, but it's the first album with our Midge on it. They'd actually been kicking around since 1974. They'd had various names in their past. The Zips, The Fire of London, London Soundtrack. They'd even been called The Damned at one point.
Really?
But, there was another Damned down there. Yeah.
Before the Damned?
Similar time. So
right.
I think it was just a mistake. The settled lineup throughout the 70s was Chris Cross on bass, Warren Cann on drums, and importantly drum machines, Billy Currie, who was both keyboards and violin, and a guy called John Fox, not his real name, you can Google his real name, John Fox FOXX. There's a good kind of late 70s new wave name for you, yeah.
Foxy bassist.
Foxy.
Is he a bassist?
No. Chris Cross was the bassist. John Fox was the kind of band leader, singer, primary lyricist and songwriter. Their first album was Ultravox ! And was, would you believe, produced by none other than Steve Lillywhite and Brian Eno.
Remind me.
Yeah, I know.
Remind me who Steve Lillywhite is. Obviously, I know Eno.
So, producer who, probably most famously with Brian Eno, was responsible for Actung Baby with U2. It's still an album I might pitch to you one day because I know you are heavily again. But I think it's a brilliant album.
But this was what? More than a decade.
This is 1976. This is like 15 years before that.
Right.
Yeah. Let's not spend too much time. Although there is a very small section of the internet that will tell you that the John Fox Ultravox is better than the Midger Ultravox, but it's very, very small. They were kind of new wavy with a little bit of experimentation. Perhaps the biggest claim to fame is on a track called Hiroshima Mon Amour. They were
is that named after the very famous French New Wave film by, I think, Alain Resnais, however you pronounce his name?
I would have to bow to your superior knowledge of French New Wave films.
I will point out that last time I checked, it was streaming on the Mubi streaming service that I set up on your TV recently. So there's no excuses.
Were it not past midnight in the UK right now, I would, after recording this podcast, get straight down there and get Hiroshima Mon Amour on my Apple TV boxy thing. But it does kind of hint at the fact that this was a band with, artistic pretensions at the very least. I've listened to all three albums. In fact, I had. So there was Ultravox exclamation mark, ha ha ha, all with exclamation marks. Go on.
Okay. Because this is the part where I'm a little bit confused, because it seems like basically my mate Midge was basically the band for a bit, but the band already had a very concrete direction. So what was going on with those first three albums, and are they any good?
So in some people's eyes, yes. I actually had the last of the three, Systems of Romance, on vinyl, even as a teenager. Never quite got onto it. It's new wave. The Hiroshima Mon Amour, the reason it's to be talked about, it's pretty much the first British band to feature a drum machine.
Oh.
So they were certainly very experimental. Yeah. So Warren Cann, in particular, the drummer, pretty good drummer, but very, very keen on experimentation with electronic stuff. It was never kind of top range new wave music in my eyes. It certainly didn't trouble the charts or the public or really the critics hugely. So they kind of, after a kind of short-lived American tour, as I understand it, touring Systems of Romance, it wasn't really going anywhere. And John Fox, in particular, wanted to leave and set up as a solo. I think he wanted to be the new Gary Newman, kind of just completely independent experimentation stuff. And he went on and did some solo stuff that some people are into, but it just kind of petered out through lack of popularity, if you like.
Yeah, well, obviously Vienna, the album we're talking about, is somewhat experimental, but also kind of punky rock and roll. I'm intrigued. Were these first three records, before what became their, I understand, primary songwriter got involved in Midge, were they kind of more electronic? Were they weirder, or were they actually poppier?
They certainly weren't poppier, and it would be hard to say they were more experimental, just because, and we'll get into this, I think the joy of those first four albums, especially Vienna and the one that followed it, Rage in Eden, was what they managed to do was really cleverly pull together the tapestry of kind of rock and roll punk, proper driving bass and drum with electronica, with some really just bloody great big good tunes and musicianship. I think they basically, look, their influences were Roxy Music, New York Dolls, David Bowie and Kraftwerk. They wore those large, and they never quite.
I could definitely hear the Dolls and Kraftwerk. Yeah, that's actually a really
yeah. And in those first three
they had
albums,
a baby,
what they managed to create,
this might be it, right?
Yeah. No, and if you like, once Midge got on board, I think something different came to fruition. But before that, in my eyes, anyway, it was like a homage to those things, but nothing new and big and special. It just was kind of like a pretty good effort, but nothing great.
But to be clear, they always had drum machines and synths. Which was pretty interesting, I would have thought, in '74, because
let's not overplay it, because there were people were using keyboards all throughout the '70s. I mean,
the drum machines.
The drum machine was definitely a new thing, and that kind of trying to experiment with properly putting electronica at the heart of some of the songs was definitely, that is something that Ultravox were definitely at the vanguard.
Because I mean, that's one of the crucial differences I always felt between '70s and '80s music. If you listen to the great '70s rock, obviously Zeppelin, Aerosmith, Stones, whoever, the whole reason it has that bit of swagger and that bit of playing around with the groove is because no one's playing to a click track, and it's got that organic breathiness, which means sometimes it's sloppy as hell, but that's also what brings in the human element. And then obviously '80s music is very, very quote unquote on the grid. You're playing to a click track.
Yeah.
Whether or not you're using an actual drum machine or not, you're definitely going to be playing to something in the ear to keep you together, but that often bringing in a mechanical element and even samples and sequences later. So that's why I'm kind of intrigued, because this obviously aesthetically fits somewhere in the middle, and it's quite raw and punky in places, but it's very much embracing the electronica. And I didn't actually know, when it became commonplace to use a drum machine. It seems 1980, 1979, when this record came out, it seems about right. But I didn't the idea they're using this a few years before this is really interesting. So.
Well, Hiroshima Mon Amour was Ha Ha Ha, which was the one for, so it's probably about 77. But yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And certainly that plenty of artists about that time will say that the invention of the drum machine changed songwriting for them, because before you always had to write with the big noisy drums in your in the room. And then suddenly you could get, you could let songs breathe and be more subtle about it, they would say, because there was just a click keeping you to the beat and you could have all kinds of other things going on instead. And sorry to be uncool, but Phil Collins says exactly the same thing. Phil Collins undeniably brilliant drummer in the 70s, but his solo songwriting he tended to do with a click track because he couldn't drum and write at the same time. And so his solo stuff is a lot more kind of sparse and empty and melodic vocally, because you just haven't got all that noise in the room. Okay, so it could have all just faded at that point, and enter stage left Midge-Ure. Now, Midge-Ure is like a microcosm of what was going on in the 80s, because if you look at what was in the charts when Vienna was released, you've basically got a song by Rainbow. A song by
like a
Motorhead,
70s Rainbow, like a 70s
rock.
Did they
band,
have members of like Deep Purple or something? There was some. What's the?
Yeah. All of that, and you had Motorhead, which were very rock. You had Blondie, bit new wave. And then you had things like you had comedy songs. Like there was a song in the top 10 when Vienna was released, which was "Oldest Swinger in Town" by some folk guy that was kind of just a jokey song, and famously Joe Dolce, "Shut Up Your Face." So there's this kind of very strange mix of stuff going on. Midge-Ure, he had a number one with a glam band called Silk in 74, 75. He was a good guitarist, so he was in The Rich Kids, which was Glenn Matlock's post.
Was he? We'll come on to this.
Okay, he was a competent, good enough guitarist and musician. A solid musician, knows his chops. So, Glenn Matlock wanted him to set up Rich Kids with. He even toured with Thin Lizzy as the guitarist.
So I am aware of all these things because I did, as preparation for this, listen back to my interview and found I asked all these questions about these bands that I've since forgotten existed. And I'd actually like to suggest that we could actually maybe release this as like an addendum. Why not? Let's just drop it as like the coda.
Yeah.
It's sitting there. The audio is sitting there. But so as he tells it, or as he told it, as I say, around 10 years ago, Silk was a bit too syrupy for him. It was a bit too clean.
Yep.
And then before he played with Glenn Matlock and Rich Kids, he was actually asked to join the Sex Pistols.
Yes, he was.
But I don't think he was asked to actually audition. I think it was more about they liked his look. I guess he looked like a punk, and for him that seemed manufactured like Silk, and that's why he doesn't regret it and all the rest of it, which read into what you will, but I thought that was fascinating. But he was clearly at the heart of a lot of interesting things happening. And he was spread thin, because as well as these quite Thin Lizzy doesn't get much more kind of 70s rock than that. The reason he got into Ultravox, or was introduced, was Visage, who you've already mentioned. And now Visage were right at the heart of the New Romantics, which was this early 80s kind of, it led to things like Flock of Seagulls, Duran Duran, even Spandau Ballet. You're talking... And wait, Rusty Egan, who was also in Rich Kids, was in Visage.
Yeah, he was the drummer of Visage. And Visage happened because there was a club whose name I've forgotten in London where the New Romantics used to hang out, and they wanted some new music for it. And so they brought in Midge because they knew he could write songs, and they brought in Billy Currie because he was a good keyboardist, and Russ Egan, the drummer, and thus Visage with a guy called Steve Strange on vocals was doing it. And they wrote a couple of albums together.
You know how when we were talking about Flying Lotus and I was just chatting about Thundercat and the LA beat scene, and you were like, whoa, how do my mates in Wiven know who the hell Thundercat is? I have some kind of idea, but for our broader listeners, what is a New Romantic?
So New Romantics were a kind of, and again, like all these genres, how tight were they? But basically, it was punk had happened. And what New Romantics did was take, in a way, the same aesthetic, which was dress madly, do your own thing, which, don't forget, in the late 70s, 80s was still a big thing. How conformist was society still at that time? But it was all about really
come on, we'd
kind
been
of,
through the 60s.
okay, fine.
And
But it was okay. It was the latest expression of youth culture, if you like, which was all about kind of big flamboyant Renaissance clothing. It was big hair, but not punky big hair, but just like big, swooping fringes. Makeup on boys. There was the start, well, not the start because we'd had it with glam, but there was some androgyny around it as well. But it was basically taking the kind of flamboyant romanticism fashions, big cuffs and a lot of material and a lot of colours. And I guess there was always with the new romantics, it was new, so there was a kind of electronic element to the music. It was keyboards, that kind of thing. A Culture Club, probably, with the famous Boy George. So there was androgynous enough to include Boy George. That kind of, and there was the club night, whose now name I can't remember, was kind of the centre of this. And right at the heart of it at that time was Billy Currie and Midge Ure writing songs with Visage around that, and that's how they met.
Which is fascinating when you think that this guy was, in Thin Lizzy and writing, playing complete cock rock. Yeah. That's really interesting because I actually wanted to ask you about Ultravox's relationship to post-punk, which I now kind of realise, hearing you describe that, post-punk, which is still a very, very, very vibrant genre today. I mean, look at the best-selling rock bands of the day, like Idols and Fontaines DC, are arguably post-punk. And this is... Yeah. But I guess this is a movement that actually, despite the fact we've got great British post-punk now, probably began in America, right? That was the whole Talking Heads, Patti Smith thing. Was New Romantics what was happening in the UK at the same time? And we didn't really do post-punk. I mean, maybe Joy Division of post-punk, arguably?
Arguably. I mean, I was 9 or 10 at the time, so my knowledge of what these genres are doing. But yeah, no, I think there's a case to be said that, if you want to do a timeline, it kind of went punk, new wave, new romantics.
Okay, so what's the difference between...
With a lot of crossing.
What's the difference between new wave and new romantics? Maybe we had new wave and they had post-punk. No, what is new wave?
Well, new wave was kind of DIY pop, if you like. So elements of the punk do-it-yourself thing. But like Blondie were a new wave band, so actually really good musicians writing good music, but keeping some of that kind of... you didn't have to be a classically trained pianist and have huge production values. So you could just record it in your
So this, in some ways, would be a rebuttal of your beloved mid-70s prog.
Oh God, definitely.
So taking the guiding aesthetic, or the guiding principles rather, taking the guiding principles of punk, but changing the aesthetic to make it more chart friendly. Would that be a fair?
Yes, I think that's a fair comment. Yeah.
So now we arrive at Vienna, which we
arrive. So Billy Currie takes Midge Ure along to meet Chris Cross and Warren Cann. So Chris Cross and Warren Cann being the rhythm section, the drummer and the bassist.
So remind me, their singer had quit essentially.
Yeah, John Fox had gone, and so there was at that point they didn't even have a record deal. It was like, is there going to be an Ultravox now? And it could have just died. But Midge Ure comes along to do, because previous to that, John Fox had done vocals and there was other guitarists who's, you can Google them. But Midge Ure came in as singer and guitarist, so it turned into
two boxes
where they were a 5-piece. Tick 2 boxes, half the, much more economical that way on tour. And they created, well, in fact, the first thing they created was Sleepwalk, which is on the album.
Really?
Yeah. It's the very, very first track they did. And they decided not to do a demo. They actually recorded it and with the producer of the album in the end, Connie Plank, who, had produced Kraftwerk and all kinds of electronica bands. And the version that's on the album is exactly what they recorded. They didn't demo it and make it better. That was what it was going to be. But on the strength of that, they got a record deal. And so went to the studio and produced Vienna, the album. Which brings us probably to the question...
You should have asked about 20 minutes ago.
I should have asked you 20 minutes ago, which is, what did you think of it?
I thought it was pretty really good, actually. I was pleasantly surprised. There's much of it that's, aesthetically a little bit jarring, shall we say, with modern ears. But I really enjoyed the gravity and sincerity. And the problem with music when it's very, very earnest is you have to buy into it, right? And we've had this conversation about, say, the Gaslight Anthem, so earnest, but if you don't buy it, you don't get it. But then, there's times where it just crosses into parody, Elton John and his... Sure. I'm in the Wild West kind of thing. And I feel like for whatever reason, I was able to get on board with this record. I think maybe because I could sense the ambition and sense that this was not just a regular rock record, that at the time it would have been very trailblazing. And I felt quite a commitment to risk taking, because 3 of the 9 songs are instrumentals, right? Which I think is quite brave.
Are they? Astrodyne is an instrumental.
If you count Mr. X, it's kind of a monologue, right? It's not.
Ah, okay, yeah. Gotcha. Yeah.
And
the third?
The other one, Western Promise, is essentially. It's got a little bit of vocals, but.
I see what you mean. Oh, yeah, no, I can get behind that. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, I totally understand what you mean. Yeah. They're
not vocalless, but they're basically instrumental songs. It is a very confusing and conflicted album, and it's very much an album of 2 halves. Would you like to talk about side A or side B first?
Well, and I love the fact you've said that, because first of all, I have to say, every time I listen to it again as an adult, which is not that often, but every time I'm so pleasantly surprised about how bloody good it is, really. And and the elements that make it bloody good are the fact that it's still got enough invention. It is a bit of its time, but it's got so much ambition and invention. It's so trying to be cinematic, which I love, whether it succeeds or not. But also at heart, the rhythm section. There's some rock in it. There's just all the instruments and stuff and going on, violins and keyboards and cinematic weird stuff. But there's a soul to it, right? It's not soulless musically. It's got a drive to it, even if they were playing to a click crack. It's got some real rock and roll energy to it, which I get off every time. And the other thing I always think is, side A, Astrodyne different. It's like an overture to the whole thing,
completely,
and their career, if you like.
And the longest track on the island, right?
On the album, and it's almost like introducing Ultravox for the next 4 or 5 albums, to be honest, and all the things they can do. And then the rest of side A is for basically not similar, fairly similar sounding pop rock Ultravox songs, where you've got the driving beat, the guitar rhythm, and you've got keyboard solos, and the lyrical themes are all pretty much and that's the thing about Ultravox, is they're quite pop, but their lyrical themes, which are pretty dark, they're all pretty bleak and existential and being separated from the world. So side A kind of really does stand as one side, and then side B is this suite of 4 songs that's much more experimental.
I completely agree. Yeah, you've got kind of 4 punk influenced, generally minor key, but with big major choruses, kind of stadium but edgy style, electro punk bangers.
Yeah,
introduced by this grandiose silliness, which somehow the way it all builds up with the strings and the crazy kind of whammy guitar and the slow build.
Yeah, and then they'll just throw some acoustic piano in it as well, just to make it different sounding.
It's a bit bonkers, but I really love it, and I think it would be perfect for like the intro credits to a sci-fi movie or something, right? But what I did realise listening to these 4 songs that follow it.
So this is New Europeans, Private Lives, Passing Strangers, Sleepwalk. Yeah.
Yes, they're very similar in tone, very similar in content. Bit formulaic because of the fact that they all exist next to each other. But I also realise that conversely, they get less angry, less edgy, and more poppy as it goes on. To my ears...
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, they do, don't they?
To my ears, New Europeans is like the edgiest, angriest, punkiest, and Private Lives is pretty punky, but a little bit toned down. Passing Strangers has got a big chorus. And then Sleepwalk is just Sleepwalk kind of loses me. I find that a little bit migraine inducing, a little bit whatever. And I thought this album is very much a construct of the vinyl age. Why would you hide the poppiest songs? Why would you slowly get more commercial? And that's why it was really amazing when I just checked, and it seems the US version literally flips the side A track order. So it starts with Sleepwalk, then does Passing Strangers, New Europeans, Private Lives. So
Astrodyne.
Yeah.
Those Americans, they want their cake first.
Sadly kind of makes sense. Yeah, so enjoy Sleepwalk and Passing Strangers and see if you've got the energy for New Europeans and Private Lives. And then if you're a real fan, you can sit through the long wanky intro. But if you don't, you could just take the needle up and skip straight to the title track. So I enjoyed it, but it did very much. Sure. It felt like it feels a little bit like a 15-minute EP of 4 punk bangers with a grandiose intro statement. And I feel like I enjoyed
Sure.
that, but I wouldn't have the same respect for the band in general if it wasn't for the greater ambition found on the second half.
Rob totally took the words out of my mouth. Yeah,
And there's an
totally
argument.
bang on.
There's an argument that it would have been a stronger album if it had been punk song, weird song, punk song, weird song, just to break the monotony. But I actually think in the Vinyl Age, having that album that you can stick on and have these kind of four, let's get going for the day, let's go to the gym, let's, whatever. And then having a weird experimental side, which is more like, oh, it's midnight and I'm, going to put on one, one last side. So I kind of see it as two EPs almost.
I couldn't agree more. And exactly, I've had that thought time and time again. And in fact, even deciding whether to punt you this album or the follow-up, Rage and Eden, listening to the two back-to-back and getting to kind of Passing Stranger and going, I can't pitch this to Rob because it just all sounds a bit the same. And then going, no, but then that is what side A is. That's your rock side. And then you flip it and you can't do side A, side B songs together because the way the three songs especially, but also arguably the fourth and last one on side B flow together.
Yes.
That's just such a great suite of stuff. You couldn't stick some cigarette paper between them. You've got to have them together because they just work so well together. Did you have time in the short time you listened to kind of get into the lyrical side of things with side A or not?
No, not really. I actually wanted to ask you because obviously calling the album Vienna is quite a brave step, and obviously speaks to the post-war separations. And I know the video was very much inspired by The Third Man, which is obviously set in post-war Vienna. And then the whole New Europe...
Was it? But we'll come on to that.
Well, the video was at least. And then obviously New Europeans speaks to... I presume. Did the UK join the Commonwealth? Was it 76 or something like that? I don't know. Well, I presume this is a statement on. I did find the lyrics where, he or she puts his headphones on and listens to a synthesized song. I find that all a bit hilarious. Like, oh my god, Walkmans though. Yeah, it's a bit like people raging about smartphones today. But yeah, you tell me.
Well, no. So actually, we joined the EEC, I think, in 1973, so well before this. But I think you're right in that. I mean, one of the things it did for me, like New Europeans, I could tell that Midge was being pretty negative about this thing that was a New European, which now I read the lyrics, and it's clearly about. There's a lot of alienation going on in the lyric of the side A, being separate from society and the real world, and with New Europeans basically being pulled into technology and away from the world through your headphone, not listening to the radio even though you've got one. But I tell you what, as an 11-year-old grew up in Felixstowe in Suffolk, I bloody well wanted to be a New European.
Yeah, I bet.
I could tell Midge wasn't keen on them, but I wanted to be one of these Europeans sitting on a beach with my headphones on, with nothing but the future spinning around, supping on the culture for today rather than the 70s culture of before.
So you've got a disconnected young European with his headphones in, and then you've got three songs which, at least from the name, are clearly people are not engaging with others, private lives, passing strangers, and sleepwalking through life. I guess.
And do you know what? You could argue that you could make it out because as it gets more popular, actually the lyrics get Sleepwalk. The lyrics are actually pretty dark. Naked and bleeding, the streetlights stray by me, hurting my eyes with their glare. Taut on the outside, I'm crumpling and crawling, watching the day drag away, spiraling deeper. I can't feel my fingers rip round my throat as I dream. Ooh, poppy.
Wow.
Exactly. I think Private Lies seems to me to be about the Euromatic scene and the Visage bit. There's a lot of it feels like it is about and also Passing Strangers, actually, just living lines from books we've read with atmospheres of days gone by, but being very sniffy about that scene and just saying how vacuous and empty it is and a moment in time and then it's gone.
I was getting a mosquito.
I've
been trying the whole last half hour.
Sure, that's very good. And in amongst all that kind of existentialism and angst, actually, although they do have the same kind of song structures, etc. They've got some musical chops, right? There's some really good instrumentals in there that I enjoy, and they, especially in things like Sleepwalk, which is not one for you, but the use of technology, that dick, 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 it sounds a bit like a Pong video game. You can see from the earlier what sets them apart as kind of originators of this stuff is they're not going to be dominated by the new sounds. They're going to use them as part of their musical palette to make a song and build it around a proper song rather than just going, the gimmick is enough.
Yeah, and I think all the bass is still organic live bass, right? But it's very much on the beat,
Most
and it's
of it,
very,
yeah.
very driving and very, very
Yeah.
danceable, but still has a bit of punk aggression.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really apparent in the third track, Private Lives, right? Like that bass really, really drums
Yeah.
it. And,
Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
and then when
yeah,
you've got the
yeah.
big kind of hey, hey, my-esque riff of Passing Strangers, you know, I've got to be honest, a lot of that guitar, that kind of very big minor chord Les Pauly thing did remind me of like what our mate Neil did later in the 80s, right? I very much hear like Touch the Night and that kind of era of like Landing on Water, Life era Neil in this music, which obviously took him several years to get there. So
Sure. Okay, so there we go. Side A, it's pretty good. Side B. I bloody love side B.
Yeah,
I just bloody love it. And
I bloody love 75% of it.
Ah, okay. What don't you like?
Surely you can guess.
Is it the last track?
Yeah, because you've got, as you say, you've got this wonderful kind of suite, which is largely instrumental, or at least certainly not song-based in the conventional sense. It's lacking in choruses. It kind of builds an intensity emotionally until you do have the big, cheesy song, which weirdly I do think stands up, and we can talk about why. And then you kind of have another silly synth melody, beat. And it just feels like a kind of weird tacked on bonus track after all the gravity. And I always imagined it was a bonus track that was like on a reissue, but it's like, no, that's meant to be part of the record. And it's almost like if there was any reordering to do to the album, go all out, chuck that on side A, and start side B with Astrodyne, and then just have all your weird shit, weird shit together. Because to me, this final track, All Stood Still, and we all stood still. I think it's up there with Sleepwalk for, grating.
Okay.
So those would be the two songs that I'm least fond of. Definitely.
All right. So where I found myself thinking that, okay, and I do get, like, how do you follow Vienna? And in fact, how do you follow the suite of Mr. X, Western Promise, and Vienna? But I tell you, the bit that does it for me is the closing sort of couple of minutes of All Stood Still, where they do go instrumental again, and there's this what feels like battle between the synth and the guitar, and they interplay each other, and that I get. The first couple of minutes fine. It does feel a bit like the side A, but that my own view, they put it on there because that battle, and they pull it off live, and it speaks to me as well, just in terms of that battle between electronica and guitar rock in
the human and the robot, and
we're going to finish with this, and it actually brings hairs to the back of my neck that last couple of minutes every time, and I go, fine, I'll let you have that as a closing track. So
I definitely enjoyed that bit too, and actually I think it's quite noticeable that I think that's probably the only proper guitar solo. So talking about Midge's competency, because what I was expecting throughout those first four bangers is that we're going to have 1632 bars of squealing at some point, right? And you never do, and that's what keeps it. That's what keeps it punk. Or I might say cyberpunk. But they never succumb to the stadium theatrics of let's do a widdly widdly guitar solo, as you like to say. But they do here, but it's not a widdly widdly one. And I quite like the outro to that song. But I think
me too.
The very kind of like insistent synth melody, the very programmed drums, and then a really cloying chorus that's like annoyingly repetitive. It doesn't really say anything. So
Oh, it doesn't say anything. I mean, that's the other thing that I think it's actually a theme in Ultravox, because later on they did a song called "Dancing with Tears in My Eyes." Clearly, about it's about and again they captured that spirit in the 80s of we all thought we were going to die of nuclear war or nuclear disaster. We just absolutely did. And please remember to mention me in tapes you might leave behind. That meant something to me as a kid. Listening to that, I genuinely thought we are going to die, and I want it to be mentioned in those tapes. And that was there was a definite pulling the heartstrings there.
Going back to the intro of this podcast, then, because a lot of people say they don't really know what defines Gen X, and then people say, "Oh, latchkey kids," like you're pre-internet, but you're not the boomers. Yeah. Maybe that was it. I don't know. You tell me. Was the existential threat of the human race being eradicated? Is that the defining feature of being Gen X? Probably.
I remember I did a paper round. I remember every morning doing my paper and going, well, I'm alive again. I actually, I don't know what this says about me. I used to imagine hosting a peace summit between Reagan and Gorbachev and trying to get them to destroy their nuclear weapons. And it was so real to you all the time. It was like, there was training around what to do if there was a nuclear bomb. It was on the news. I remember seeing, do you remember Tomorrow's World? Did you ever come across Tomorrow's World? Which was a BBC programme about, technology that was going to be there in 20 years' time. But they did an episode on, look, this is actually how a nuclear attack from Russia will pan out. Like in first 2 minutes, well, that's Eastern Europe gone. Sorry, after 7 minutes, London's gone, kind of thing. It was so real, and actually, All Should Stood Still did massively speak to me about that.
Oh well.
Okay,
I just saw people dancing in a playground.
Okay, very different, very different. Mr. X, when I haven't listened to this album for a while, I expect to be bored of Mr. X because in your head it's this ding 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 ding. But my God, the way they layer it and the cinematic experience of it, and the fact that again it feels like a black and white movie and this mysterious character and what is it and French existentialism and even just I've listened to it a lot in the last week. I'm never bored of it. I should be because there's not a lot goes on. But just to say, it's not Midge doing the vocals; it's the drummer doing the sort of spoken word thing. But also, you do go from side A, this kind of exciting, I think, driving kind of to just they go, okay, now we're going to do this cinematic. And if you go deep into the kind of internet of techno music, Mr. X by Ultravox is sometimes mentioned as a deeply influential piece of work in terms of the future of electronic music and techno and all of that.
Oh, I can well believe that. Actually, this song made me think of a few things. I mean, really interestingly, I think whole bands have probably built their careers around this. There's actually like a quote unquote lounge punk band here in Hong Kong called Logo, who basically made a whole career doing this. Yeah. But no, I felt a little bit marauder there for sure. Yeah. Like in the use of electronics, only this is not disco music. This is haunting and weird. And then I also maybe heard Laurie Anderson in the strings and the spoken word and the building weirdness.
Okay,
those are the only kind of references I have. But otherwise, I thought it was completely compelling. It grabbed me. It's one of those. It's both an experimental work in a sense, but then it grabbed me instantly. So it's almost eerily catchily in that kind of very pentatonic bass line and the way it just goes up a key, I think, and. It's kind of instantly familiar. It's not actually get complicated. Yet, as you say, it's all in the textures. And those textures and sounds would have been so new at that moment. I obviously want to know what it's about. I haven't sat down and listened. But I know that one of my favourite French post-New Wave directors, Leo Carac, who I just had the chance to see in person actually last week, is famous. His nickname is Mr. X. And I now wonder... Because he started in the mid '80s, and he's a bit of an enigmatic figure who loves kind of new romantic new wave music. So I'm wondering if this was kind of if he took his nickname from this song.
Maybe they've never said who's it about. There was a rumor that it or a thought that it, but they have denied that it was about John Fox, the former lead singer who had 2 X's of the Fox, and but they've said no, it wasn't. It feels to me it's sort of like a Waiting for Godot kind of impossible of finding this character that you want to. What's a human being anyway? The impossibility of real emotion, but there's this horror to it as well. And some of the sounds. That thing about this is the time when they just invented sounds that had never like now every single sound that you could ever make has been heard. But some of the haunting chanting stuff. It's put through some kind of vocodary thing. Amazing.
I mean, honestly, Dave, there's many reasons why I might wish you were in my life 10 years ago. But what the biggest one right now is that we would have had this conversation. I could have asked Midge myself, who's it about?
That is very true. Although I think it was the drummer that mainly did the lyrics on this one, so he would have to he'd have to refer to Warren. Okay, so it does Mr. X, and then. Oh, Western Promise. What a banger. What a banger. And there's a bit of it that sometimes thinks the keyboard line, the da 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 is done too much. But it comes in.
This is the song that has that massive modulated synth thing.
It does, but it also what makes it an absolute banger is because they could have gone, we've done Mr. X, no real drums, but they put some proper real drums on this, and they're fucking in your face, right? da 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 da. I just love it. And then in the middle of it all, the bit where Midge goes, "Hey." I can't. Whatever I'm doing, I have to go, "Hey" to that. It's just brilliant.
I mean, it's basically Kraftwerk with a Scottish accent, which I've got to love.
And some real rock and roll drive to it. And I tell you the other thing it's got in is that, again, as a 10 or 11-year-old listening to this first time, the lyrics clearly about essentially how, you know, the US and the West kind of tried to destroy Japan and after the Second World War. This was, I think, the dawning of my political global awareness. I'd never thought about, you know, the West being evil before. This is the first time I would have thought about that. So the text of this album, a lot of extension, but the internationalism, this, you know, Western Promise and New Europeans, genuinely growing up in Suffolk, it gave me a global outlook that I'd never had before, because it made me think about the rest of Europe and Japan in a way I never had done. And I love the lyric, all ultra neon, sign of the times, your Buddha Zen and Christian man, all minions to Messiah, Pepsi can. Wow. Just love all that. Brilliant. And then, of course, it flows into
which I thought we were going to start off talking about, but I mean, what can we possibly say about this song that hasn't been said before?
The first thing I'd say is when it comes on, and boy do they know it's a classic, because you get that low bum bum, and you suddenly go, oh my god, actually Mr. X and Western Promise, it's almost like they're just intros to this song, you know, they're just setting you up for Vienna in all of its glory. Yeah, what can we say? I mean, it's, you know, who doesn't love Vienna? I don't know anybody that doesn't love Vienna. It's just an awesome. Go on.
There are those songs that are kind of so immortal that you've heard them and recognise them in seconds. And I would say 2 out of 3 of those songs, when you hear them, you go, ugh. And 1 out of 3 of those songs, you go, yeah. And even like, you know, the Beatles, a lot of their songs fall in the latter camp. But there's still the obli-dees and obli-das. There's still those like, oh, really? Moments.
Yeah.
And there's some songs that just don't get boring. And of course, everyone has different takes. But I was actually surprised, as someone that, you know, recognised this song but hadn't really ever actively listened to it before, how strong it actually was. I guess I think of it as like a Radio 2 background music, kind of in your granny's living room kind of song. But actually, as you say, with the slow build, and actually a bit like Mr. X, it's got that, you know, I love how primitive some of the drums are. They're boom, boom, boom. Like, like I think Mr. X is like boom, chit, boom, boom, chit, boom, chit, boom, boom, chit, which is like the first beat on like a Casio keyboard when I was growing up, right? You know, so. But to take those, it's kind of this 2-chord thing, and just taking it, like building such intensity slowly, and that piano riff, like again, it's so simple but so recognizable. And actually, in that sense, again, it reminds me of electronic music, because you know how a lot of like big, rosy house music would have a very, very simple keyboard part, but somehow was just so familiar. And sometimes it was a sample, sometimes it had been written, but you instantly, it would go round and round and round, and it was just unmistakably that one song. It's one of those piano riffs. Sure. It's just one of those, like, it couldn't be... you know it instantly, and yet it doesn't cloy somehow. It just feels genuine.
Sure. So, in terms of what it all means, the video is clearly quite third man influence, but what the band say is that when they were writing it, that wasn't it at all. Apparently, Billy Currie wanted to do something, you know, great and classical, and have a slow build and a slow outro, etc. And Mitchell said, when he heard the kind of early demo, well, this means nothing to me.
Really?
And the producer said, sing that. And from that grew, and for Midge, it was literally about a failed holiday romance. But obviously they then
to Vienna,
more imagery, etc. Yeah.
Oh, that's so funny, because I did want to believe some kind of like Cold War narrative to this whole thing, with Western Promise and Europeans, and then Vienna.
Yeah.
But
I think that's interpretation after the fact. But the video, have you seen the video?
No.
Have you watched the video?
Not lately. Okay. I must have seen it in my life.
Okay. And I hadn't for a long time until this week. You cannot underestimate the impact of that video. This is pre-MTV. I mean, the record company wouldn't stump up the money for it, so the band put the $5 or $6 to make it. Quite why? Because it's pre-MTV, so there's no heavy rotation of videos. There's no of them together. You know, it was on Top of the Pops, and it was a mega thing on Top of the Pops. But just what a thing to do! And just to remind you of the video, it's this kind of smorgasbord. Yeah, there's horses in it. There's black and white and colour. There's shots into Art Deco statues. There's kind of old-fashioned 20s press black and white things flashing. There's what feel like there's an opera, and there's ballet, and there's people from the Euromantics with like machine hands, and it feels like then there's kind of like Franz Ferdinand from the Austro-Hungarian Empire thing in an opera, and then there's this lovely bit where a woman goes down the stairs to the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and she comes down the stairs in a big flowing thing, and then it ends in a gunshot, and because she shoots the guy, and then there's the band kind of doing that video thing of just, Midge wandering around in a pencil moustache with a Max singing it, and you just go, what were you what were you thinking in 1980? What does it all mean? It doesn't matter. What matters is they said video can be art, and we're just throwing everything we know at it, and it just feels to me like, a whole genre of trying to do more than just singing in front of your drum kit was born through this video. And the video is mad. It is too overblown, but it is an amazing. What were they thinking? But it's incredible.
That sounds wonderful, and I will definitely program that. I would spend a good 5.5 minutes watching it. If you go away and spend 89 minutes watching Hiroshima and Mon Amour. Deal?
I will. I don't know who's got the worst deal there. I suspect I have, but yes, okay, I will do that. I will do that. Excellent. So...
No, it's interesting you talk about the budget and them paying for it themselves, because it does seem like, an experimental work and not a cheap work to make. Do you know much about the sessions? Was this album quick and easy? Was this a labour of love? How were these songs even written? Because as you said, it's a brand new lineup. Are these all Midge's songs? Can you tell me a little bit more? Do you know any more about the process you can tell me?
They, as far as I know, they always wrote collectively and they bounced off each other. So it was a proper meeting of musical minds with Warren Can, the drummer, being right in the middle of that, because he did like to do different textures and electronic sounds, etc. So it was genuinely. I mean, I'm sure like any, you come in with the odd idea, but most of it, because a lot of it's in the arrangement. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is how the textures of the songs are arranged together, and clearly, there's 4 people that have considerable musical chops working that out, and for 4 albums at least, managing not to fall out over that and create some really good work.
Because I'm really interested that, as I say, a guy can come into an existing outfit and basically remold the band seemingly in his own image to a certain extent, but as you say, it was a collaborative effort. What happened after this? Was this the band's peak, commercially, critically?
Yeah, no, I mean, they had a sustain. I mean, and in some ways they were short-lived, but in some ways, how many bands can say? And I'll do the quick part history, but they had 4 albums definitely classic period that were good, and they had at least 10 top 30 hits from it. So Vienna came out. Vienna itself was a massive hit. They went into the studio and did. I almost pitched it to you, Rage in Eden. I love it. It's colder, darker in a way. There's not even they'd sort of lost a little bit of the rock, I guess, by that point. But there's some really, really strong tracks on it. They then did an album called Quartet, which was interestingly produced by George Martin of Beatles fame, but apparently, and it's probably the weakest of the 4, although there's some really good stuff on it. There's rumours that George Martin was deaf by then and wasn't at his best, shall we say, but there's still some good stuff. And then they came back, this was their real commercial peak, with an album called Lament. Probably a lot more middle of the road kind of, it was mid-80s by then, kind of guitar-based rock, if you like, although also some, lots of electronica in it. But they had a couple of big hits. And the biggest hit was Dancing with Tears in My Eyes, which was top 10, big hit. And it was,
great title.
Again, it was all about, and it was all potential Dancing with Tears in My Eyes because the nuclear bomb's about to hit.
Oh, I thought
it was all about what you do.
I thought just because your potential partner was dancing with somebody else, but all right.
No, you're dancing with your partner with tears in your eyes because you're both about to die because, boom, we're all going to, get blown to smithereens by the Russians was the subtext of that particular happy song. So they did those 4 albums. And crucially, I think the thing to say about how they influenced electronic music coming into the mainstream, and I remember that, because there was this big thing about, there's guitar rock bands and they play live, and electronic bands, they can't do it live. They can't, it's just all studio trickery. These guys could play live. I mean, they were shit hot, and they did a live album called Monument as well, which is really, really good. They pulled this stuff off live, so they had some credibility around that. Live Aid happened. They were in Live Aid.
Yes.
You can see their gig on Live Aid. It's pretty good. It's all right. He manages to pull off the vocals to Vienna in front of the whole world, which is no mean feat. Midgeor had a solo album called called The Gift, with a single on it called If I Was. And it all started to fall apart a bit then. So they got back into the studio after Live Aid. And obviously the story behind Live Aid, have you heard the story about Bob Geldof wanted to put Band Aid together? He'd half written a song and it wasn't sort of going very well. But he got Midgeor involved. Yeah. And apparently as soon as he said to the pop rock fraternity of 1984, oh, but Midge is on board, everybody came on board at that point, because while they didn't trust Bob Geldof to sort of hold it together to write a decent song and produce stuff well enough, everybody trusted Midge because they knew he's just a safe musical pair of hands. So that's his part in Band Aid.
Fun fact, he self-deprivatingly told me that his greatest contribution was changing there won't be snow in Ethiopia to there won't be snow in Africa, because Ethiopia just doesn't scan. But I think it's clear that his contribution was a little bit more than that.
I think he did a little bit more than that. Yeah, bless him. So they got back in the room after all of that and fell out, basically. Well, they kicked the drummer out, Warren Cam, which is such a shame, because I think he's a big part of the kind of creativity and drive of whether he's doing subtle drum loops or big drums. But the rest of the band wanted to make another rock album. He wanted to do an album that was just electronic drums. He didn't want to do any drumming. He wanted to go more experimental. So they kicked him out and got the drummer in from...
The drummer didn't want to drum, essentially.
Yeah. Bless him.
But
He's actually American or Canadian.
Yeah.
Sorry?
He wanted to keep the paycheck.
He wanted the paycheck.
Yeah.
Possibly. No, I mean, he wanted to do, he's into rhythm and experimentation. He didn't want to do, So they got Mark Brzezicki, who was the drummer from Big Country, who you've probably never heard of, but were a pretty big Scottish rock band of that era. Very good drummer. And they did an album called Ultravox. But that time, and my theory on this is, look, in the early 80s, they really did, and for me personally, they straddled in a world where it's so tribal between electronic music and rock music. Like, it just was so, and they managed to straddle it. But by mid-80s, actually, and especially post-Live Aid, they were neither arena or stadium rock, because their music isn't really arena or stadium rock, but neither were they proper electronica, Depeche Mode, Club Night, dance EDM stuff. They weren't proper cool, electronica. So they kind of fell.
The late 80s was probably the beginning of dance music culture. Really, that was kind of That's obviously
prop stuff.
The hacienda and all that stuff was happening. So I think
and
dance
and drugs,
like
and
electronic music that was kind of a subculture started actually presumably breaking through to the mainstream, because definitely by the early mid 90s it was everywhere. It was pop music basically.
Yeah, exactly. So they actually, in my memory, became pretty uncool pretty quickly, because they were uncool to the rockers of the world. U2 Simple Minds, to put it simply. They were very uncool to those fans, and they were uncool to the proper dance fans. So they
Simple
just
Minds
were
seen as more cool than Ultravox.
Yeah, in my school anyway. Write in if you disagree.
That's so interesting, because when you first mentioned Ultravox, you expected me to find them a deeply uncool concept, whereas I think for whatever reason, because I was maybe a little bit aware of the links to all the other bands we discussed earlier and Midge's kind of reputation as a national treasure, I just assumed they were like a kind of legendary band. I didn't really realise that they had...
No, they really fell off a cliff in terms of popularity. Yeah, so they fell apart after Ultravox. I've got Ultravox. I had Ultravox on cassette tape, and actually there's some good stuff on it, but it was pretty... They had the Chieftains, the Irish folk band on it. They'd become really quite Radio 2 by that point, if you like. Yeah.
So in short, they don't get weirder from Vienna. That's the big thing. You're saying this Radio Eden's a bit weirder, and then...
You could make an argument that Rage and Eden's a bit weirder, but by Lament, which is the mid with the two big they certainly were more mainstream. So what happened next? very quickly, Warren Cahn didn't really. He went back to America or Canada. He did some movie writing. He does and wrote about tech. Basically, he just crisscrossed the bases, went off and trained to become a psychotherapist, and just turned his back on the whole music thing. Billy Currie did some solo albums. He did a kind of faux Ultravox with none of the other members in the 90s, which didn't really take off. Midjaw had a moderately successful solo career and became a bit of a national treasure because he did become this trusted. So he ran the Nelson Mandela birthday concert.
I was at that.
Well, there you go. He ran it, and he sort of curated, the Prince's Trust concerts where Prince Charles did these rock concerts for charity, and he also did Live 8 with Bob Geldof after Live 8. And there's a slightly sad bit where he spent 3 years making an album called Breathe, and he just said, there's an autobiography, I haven't read all of it, but he said he released it and he just there was no press, there was no one wanted to know, and he just realised he was, gone as far as the kind of music world was. He slipped into alcoholism, which he's been quite open about, but slowly since then has become this. He's released more albums. He's done some shows with the rich kids, and he had a big 70s birthday bash in the Royal Albert Hall where enough people went to, and so he has become a good enough kind of national treasure and solo tours still. But
and then he reformed Ultravox, right? To release the not so self-effacingly named album Brilliant. But I loved how that came, I think, within a year of a solo album he did called Fragile.
Yes.
Which are two sides of, perhaps his coin.
Yeah.
And I know this because it was in the slipstream of these records that I spoke to him. He talks a lot about his biggest regret being not following through with Ultravox in the late 80s and walking away when he did. And a lot about why he came back to make the new record.
Yeah, just to talk about how that came about and what's lovely, and it is just lovely and it warms my heart because, there's a lot of people that have a lot of warmth towards Ultravox, I think. Basically, in 2009, the original four, they made up with Warren Cahn, and Midjaw was very open about the fact he shouldn't have kicked him out, it was awful, or they shouldn't have done. And they decided to do some shows. And there's a lovely documentary where they're all driving to a rehearsal studio. They'd not really met, all feeling nervous and not played together for so long. And they did a couple of tours in 2009, 2010. And there's a lovely video of them at the Roundhouse in London. And this is what I mean about them. They were never massive after it. And they did, the tour was they did Hammersmith Apollo one night, so 3,500 people, so they are enough to fill that, but, not a really big reunion act, right?
And you didn't go and see them, clearly.
No, this was, I was in a different world then, but I've subsequently, about 5 years ago, I came across it on YouTube, and it's so heartwarming because you can see the band slightly nervous, not knowing how they're going to be received, and there's just 3,500 blokes about my age, just so tears in their eyes on every song, just thinking they'd never hear the proper lineup do these songs again, and it's such a lovely, warm thing, and they went on tour as a result. And, decided in the middle of it, well, let's write another album called Brilliant. It's all right. It's unfortunate that Warren Cahn, because of his film commitments, couldn't sit in a room and write with them. And it's really clear he couldn't because it does feel like the drums are an add-on. But it's one of those albums that's better than you might think it is after all those years, but not as good as it needs to be really up there. But it's okay. Okay, so it sounds to me like I'm counting that as a hit rather than a miss. I think
sure, yeah.
It feels like you've enjoyed that. Where would you ideally think is the best way to listen to this remarkable album?
Well, I'm kind of torn because I do definitely hear a lot of cyberpunk, and part of me wants to be kind of either wandering around Shibuya or taking the Central Mid-Levels escalator here in Hong Kong. But because of the overt ideas of nuclear apocalypse that you've put in me here, and having done a fair bit of kind of soul-searching train travel in Eastern Europe, I think I'd like to be rolling around the Baltics on trains, looking at the open plains, contemplating the vastness and divisions of the continent that we kind of call home, but ostracize ourselves from.
Very cool.
So, Dave, you talked a little bit about how this album kind of shaped your growing geopolitical awareness. How old were you when you first heard this music?
Yeah, so I was, because Vienna, the single was released in 1981, so I was 9, because it was early 1981. And I remember loving Vienna when I was 9. after those first four albums, I can't remember quite, it would have been 1984 or something like that. They did a best of called The Collection. And I asked for The Collection on LP for Christmas. And I wore the grooves out of The Collection. I was lucky enough to get the version that had an extra LP in it of 7 or 8 12-inch versions of some of these songs as well. And just after getting The Collection, the best of, I bought this and Rage in Eden on a 2-into-1 cassette. So
Wow.
the record company had released it. Had released, one on each side. And it was my proper first band. Properly, I mean, up till this point, I'd bought a Boney M single, but I'd never bought an album. And this was for 6 to 9 months that I was the biggest, 12, 13-year-old Ultravox fan. And I absolutely loved it. I got Lament quickly after on vinyl, and then Quartet after that. So those 4 albums, and they genuinely, I did progress out of them into, I have to say, U2 for a year or two after that. But when I look back and I listen to this music, I go, well, it doesn't actually surprise me. Some of the music, I do hear a bit of prog in them, in things like Astrodyne and some of the instrumental work. But I also do just hear, proper rock in them, and I guess also, oddly, and that sounds really snooty and something, but just kind of high standards. They're good songs. They wrote good songs and they thought about them, and they're not throwaway. They're music that's kind of thought about. If you can throw something at Ultravox, is they are, I accept this. They're a little bit soulless. They're a little bit emotionless. It's a bit cold and clean. When I learned to love music with more emotion as I got older. But this was my absolute proper first love band. So they were my version of your Bon Jovi. If
I
you
was
like.
about
So
to
they'll always
say,
have
you kind of win that fight, don't you?
I don't know. maybe out of obscurity. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Bon Jovi's. It's not competition anyway. But yeah,
Fine.
yeah. I don't know. Well, I don't know because they're genuinely not that cool. There would be people that I went to school with that they'd remember the kind of the later period kind of poppy rock stuff and go, yeah, no, that's just insipid Radio 2 pop. But there you go.
Okay.
I think they're great still. Okay, that was my brother getting to know Ultravox Vienna. On the back of that, Rob, what are we going to enjoy next?
Well, I was actually still debating this last night. Okay. First of all, because I'd like to respond with a more contemporary take on a bunch of hip rockers embracing electronic instruments to subvert the normality and create modern fusion. And secondly, just because I want to reclaim some credibility after pitching you Bon Jovi in my last episode, I am going to grope for the ultimate aging hipster dad band, LCD Sound System, which of course means we've got to hear the masterpiece Sound of Silver. Is it Sound or Sounds? Sound of Silver.
Fantastic. I very much look forward to that from a place of complete ignorance, so that's going to be a lot of fun. If you have been listening, thank you very much. Catch you next time. Bye.